right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the nonprofit panel for the Decoding Budget 2024 for Science and Innovation. My name is Peter Searles. I'm a volunteer with the Canadian Science Policy Centre for a few years now in a number of different capacities. And I have the pleasure of being for my day job, a Schmidt Science Fellow at Caltech, as well as being a CSPC volunteer with a lot of my time. I'd like to start by saying that I'm coming to you from Toronto, and I wish to acknowledge this land on which I live and work. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to work on and be a steward of this land. For today's panel, I have four excellent people to introduce that we'll be speaking with today. First, I'd like to introduce Sarah Laframboise, the Executive Director of Evidence for Democracy. Next, Kate Murray, the President and CEO of the Stem Cell Network. We have John Hepburn, the Chief Executive Officer of MyTax, and Micheline Ayoub, the Executive Director at Sustainability in the Digital Age and Director at Future Earth Canada Hub. Thank you, all four of you, for joining us today to discuss this. I'd like to remind the audience that you can send in questions throughout the next half hour as they come up using the Q&A feature, and you can upvote relevant questions that you'd like to see answered, and we'll get to them based on the upvoting that we see and the time that we submit them. You can also use the chat line to communicate with any of the organizers. So with that, let's jump right into it. If you have some opening remarks, we'll begin with Micheline, please.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, CSPC, for the invitation. Good afternoon, colleagues of the panel, and good afternoon, everyone. I will start, before I start with my thoughts on the budget, I will start to say a few words about who we are and how I took this lens on the budget. Future Earth is a global network of networks of researchers and innovators working to accelerate transformations to global sustainability. It is supported by a distributed secretariat in 9 countries, Montreal being one of them. It is focused on addressing global systemic challenges in a transdisciplinary manner. And it was created to strengthen the interface between policy, business, and science, and advance the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 SDGs. However, the SDGs, the 17, do not address the governance of one of the most powerful forces defining humanity's future, the digital age. Hence, we thought about it and we started doing consultations. In 2018, our hub began to ask that question: what if we put the digital age in an SDG 18, which outlined clear targets for leveraging the transformative power of the digital age to benefit both people and the planet? Our consultations on the topic resulted in a publication we call the Digital Disruptions for Sustainability Research Agenda, which is on our website, or the D2S Agenda, which explores the opportunities and challenges of leveraging the digital age towards a sustainable, climate-safe, and equitable world. The digital revolution could quickly drive a transformation to a more sustainable and equitable world, but only if there is a conscious effort to steer it in that direction. SDA is now, or Sustainability in the Digital Age, is now a think tank of Concordia University in Montreal, and we are supported by the provincial science funds. We work under 3 pillars of activities: research, training, and guidance for decision makers. So as you have heard, we work a lot on sustainability. Sustainability is at the core of what we do. Hence, I took that lens into looking into the budget. When I looked at it as a nonprofit working in sustainability, I thought, well, all the work or all the mention of nonprofit in the budget does not necessarily pertain to our work. However, I did note a few mentions of things that would be important to us. Now, I did not put the numbers on it because they do get mentioned in very many different places, and I did not go into the exercise of adding those numbers. However, I was happy to see that the budget mentions transition to a net zero economy, which is important for us as a net zero, meaning decarbonizing the economy and decarbonizing the environment. There is something mentioning the price on pollution that is the foundation of Canada's plan to build a prosperous net zero economy again. There is a lot of places where decarbonization is mentioned, which is for us also something to work towards for sustainability. There is a mention that the government has taken significant steps to fight climate change, which is also something we like to see and we work on and we collaborate on. There is a mention that the government put a price on carbon pollution. Now, I'm not commenting on the price and how it works, but the fact that it is being acknowledged that carbon does cause pollution and we need to acknowledge that, and it is acknowledged in the budget, it is something that we are happy to see as well. There is also a mention that the government has implemented for the first time in history policies that would help us here in Canada exceed the climate targets in 2026 compared to the 2005 levels. I would like to wait and see if that is going to happen. However, that is also something we would like to see. There is also several times mention of conservation of nature. There is also mention of the cost of the climate inaction that could be too high to pass on. And we definitely like this message. This is something also we always say in our discussions and in our work. There is also a mention of including the youth in the fight to climate change. That is something that is also sweet to our ears because we think the youth are very active and they have very good new ideas on how to help in this crisis. And we do, in the education we do work with youth as well. So for us, it is something good to hear about. And at the end, I think it's worth mentioning the support that the government is giving to the infrastructure and computer power for Canadian researchers and for AI startups and scale-ups. As our name mentions, sustainability in the digital age is very much intrigued by what digitization can do to sustainability and how digitalization can be sustainable. I do hope that those startups and scale-ups will take that into consideration. And if not, maybe there is collaboration to be done with them in order to work together on those issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Micheline. And now if we can hear from John Hepburn.
Great, thank you very much. First of all, thank you to the CSPC for organizing are familiar with what we do. We are a not-for-profit, obviously, like everyone else here. We're very large, not-for-profit, quite generously supported by the federal and provincial governments. And basically, we're in the business of promoting innovation through what we call internships, which means we support graduate students largely and postdoctoral fellows to work on collaborative research projects, mostly with industry partners to universities, but also with not-for-profit partners, with hospitals, with municipalities. And so our business is innovation, but the way we do that is through supporting students and postdoctoral fellows, trainees from the universities to work on projects that are defined outside the university by our non-academic partners. In other words, using university knowledge and talent to solve a societal problem. And all of our activities are in those areas, also solving Canadian problems by creating international networks and strong international researcher exchanges. So 15% of our activity is international. It came up in the last session about promoting international connections. We spend a lot of money and effort on promoting international connections, always to the benefit of Canada and Canadian research and innovation. So the comment on the budget, I don't want to repeat a lot of what's been said in previous sessions, but this budget really focuses on two key factors of the research and innovation ecosystem. And those two key factors are talent and infrastructure. And so huge investments. I think everybody was surprised, frankly, by this budget. I remember talking with folks like Alejandro Adem when the budget was being prepared, and they were all wondering that Tri-Council presidents I know at the time were wondering, how can they absorb a 3% budget cut? And I want to emphasize that not only did they not get a 3% budget cut like most programs in government, but they got an immediate 3% budget increase. So getting an increase in the current budget environment is already a triumph. Getting the increase that they got over 5 years is actually, I think, beyond anybody's expectations. And so really we've got to thank government for doing this, for putting this emphasis, but also, and this came up in the last session, I think it was student advocacy. And of course, we're big fans of students at MyTax. That's where our money goes. Most of the money that we transfer to universities, in fact, pays students and postdoctoral fellows. So we believe firmly in talent at MyTax. Fortunately, the government agreed with that with this budget. Remember that the vast majority of students who get advanced degrees from our universities, masters, PhDs, and even postdoctoral fellows, they're not going to work in the academic sector. They're going to work in the private and public sector. They're going to work for profits. They're going to work for industry. They're going to work for government. And so I think it's critical for the students to have those connections, the kind of connections that we provide, that MyTax provides, but also there's innumerable work integrated learning organizations supported by government and supported by universities. So I was very happy to see talent emphasized, very happy also to see infrastructure, like the enormous investment in artificial intelligence infrastructure and the key national research laboratories that were supported. All of this has come up in previous sessions, but I really want to emphasize that. There wasn't much money for not-for-profits in this budget, but recall there were allocations made under the Strategic Science Fund this past year. And so many of us on this call benefited from those allocations. So, there wasn't specific allocations. There were a few specific allocations like the new organization for Safe AI that's going to go to CFAR, which is another not-for-profit. So there was some small amount of funding for not-for-profits, but most of the funding was for really university-based research and industry innovation, which, given, as I said previously, that our students, when they graduate, will typically work in industry. It's great to see the support for industrial innovation. Canada needs more of it. That's where the real gap is. So all of that is very positive. I think that where not-for-profits can continue to play a role, and I was really struck by David Waters' listing of 10 key challenges that need to be addressed. 5 out of 10 of them were clearly social challenges, and the other 5 had very strong social connections, social enterprise, and really societal connections. That's where the not-for-profits play. That's where they have a strong role to play. And thus, when the new advisory committee gets created, I hope that there will be a very strong voice, not just from students, but also from the not-for-profit sector, because a lot of the issues confronting Canadian society and the globe today really are addressed by not-for-profits. And so I think that we have a role to play, a very strong role to play, both in fostering and promoting talent and innovation, but also in advising governments through advisory bodies on how best to address societal challenge from a societal point of view in addition to a technological point of view. So I think I'll stop there to keep us more or less on schedule.
Great. Thank you, John. Now we'll invite Sarah.
Thanks, Peter. And thanks so much to CSPC for putting this panel together. I'll echo the congrats on putting together such a diverse panel. Throughout the day today, I was able to attend some of the sessions, and I'm going to try my best not to repeat sentiments that have been going through this, but I will be biased in my answers for things that I've been advocating for the last couple of years as well. So I'm here today as the Executive Director of Evidence for Democracy. If you haven't heard of us, we are a nonpartisan, not-for-profit that advocates for the transparent use of evidence in policy and decision-making in Canada. And to do this, we do a lot of original research, we do issue-based campaigns, and we focus a lot on training for next-generation researchers on science policy skills. And as part of this mandate, advocating for research funding has been a key priority of us since we were founded. And I myself worked with E4D a few years ago when we were starting co-creating the Support Our Science campaign, which I was fortunate to serve as the executive director before my role here at Evidence for Democracy. So E4D also was kind of born out of a very politically turmoil time. We were born out of the war on science. This was during the Harper Conservative government, which was plagued with some funding cuts to research, both federally and externally, and a lot of silencing of scientists' ability to speak about their research to the media and to the public. So it's natural that since this time, so almost 11 years now, we've been assessing budgets over the tenure of our organization. And part of this evolution was really interesting for us to reflect on going through Budget 2024, because this was probably the biggest budget for research that we've seen in this past decade, with maybe some exception with Budget 2018, which had some significant investments post Harper. As was mentioned, a lot of the efforts and wins that were in this budget are truly a testament to some of this collective action from advocacy groups. And if I take any lesson and kind of echo some of the sentiments here, it's really about the fact that grassroots mobilization was so vital to this. Graduate student and postdoc voices were at the center of a lot of this advocacy. Myself, I was able to speak to the Standing Committee on Science and Research on 2 occasions on this topic, and I know many of the other panelists here did as well. I was able to bring like nearly 30 graduate students into the House of Commons to be present for when a lot of these discussions were happening. We were present on the Hill 3 times over the last 2 years. We had a nationwide walkout at Support Our Science. And, a lot of this was really a testament of giving a voice to graduate students and postdocs to be a part of this. So I wanted to echo that, grassroots mobilization works, storytelling works, putting faces to this issue really worked. And I want to congratulate everyone who has been advocating for the scholarships and fellowships on a big win for this. Key takeaways from this budget go beyond the scholarships and fellowships, but the first thing that we can talk about with the scholarships and fellowships are really the harmonization. And opening up that harmonization and creating that will open the door to a lot of policy and kind of re-looking at all of the Tri-Council acts. So we have to be asking ourselves a lot of questions there about, what does this mean for international students? How will this break down in the number of scholarships given to different fields? Other things like term limits, I think, are up for negotiation here. And so making sure that we get diverse voices at the table for a lot of those discussions will be really important. We've talked a lot about the capstone organization today, and the scholarships and fellowships are supposed to be one of those first things that are delivered from this capstone organization as a bit of this harmonization. So there's lots of questions of, what will that look like? Even some of the dialogue today was, if the capstone is executed, to me, I asked, well, what about the scholarships and fellowships, and who will execute that if there isn't kind of this organizational structure? So there's lots of questions there. And this is impacting a lot of graduate students and postdocs who saw this win as well. So it's important for us to make sure that we get good answers to that. As we know, being a next-gen researcher is precarious by nature. So being able to predict steady funding for your own studies is really important. So having some predictability there for students, in 6 months from now, we should probably have some answers so that people know what to do when the next grant cycles start to come out. It's also been brought throughout the sessions today that not all students get these scholarships and fellowships. And so the next question then is really, where does this place pressure on the system? And it goes then to kind of this university department level where you have to set stipend levels that will then kind of decrease this big gap now that exists between students who get scholarships and fellowships and who are funded directly through the universities. And for Tri-Councils to kind of help negotiate some of the pains that this will likely kind of bring, because we're likely looking at kind of 2 different situations where we'll see either an increase in the size of those core research grants to compensate with, a compensation of a declining success rate, or it'll be that, we're going to see the smaller size grants, and you'll be forced to hire fewer graduate students with that same amount of money. So it's important to reflect on kind of what that will actually look like on the ground, because part of everything that Supporter Science has really been advocating for has been to make sure that every single graduate student and postdoc gets universal kind of changes to their salaries, not just the scholarships and fellowships. And E4D and Supporter Science have been working over this past couple of years with the Coalition on Canadian Research. We heard from Chad Gaffield from U15, who has been instrumental in kind of organizing that effort. But there's been, almost 13 organizations that were part of this. And I wanted to share an anecdote. So the night that the budget was announced, I was able to be in lockup, and when I was leaving that, I was able to run into Minister Champagne that evening and talk to him about the investment. And part of what he had said back was that he was so thankful that we made it so easy for him. And I think this is an interesting anecdote because, the unification of all of these voices and the message that we showed was so easily transferable to what he could then say to the Minister of Finance. In his words, it was almost copy and pasted from our campaigns to be delivered to the Minister of Finance. And so this is a huge success for our organization that we were, or for all of our sector, that we were able to kind of bring together all of these voices and collectively be so on the same message and branding that we made this an easy win. And I really want to take that and look at how we can mobilize this in the future. In light of some uncertainty with a lot of these, the different structural changes and things like this, it's really important that we stay connected. It's tempting when things get uncertain for us to kind of resort back to our key mandates and our key agendas. But I think in moments like this, we have to really retain the power of us all being together. And we can look at instances like this advisory council, for example, where we can play a really big role in setting the standard for what we want that to say and do for research in Canada. Part of that is making sure that not-for-profit and diverse voices are within that. And that's a huge opportunity for us to negotiate kind of what that capstone organization will look like. And so making sure that we're at the table for a lot of those discussions. And, making sure that graduate students and youth are also in those conversations and have a say in what that's going to be created. I'll end with kind of just how did we get here? I think part of all of this is that we haven't really seen an increase in those scholarships and fellowships in 21 years, but we did it this year. And so I think it's important for us to reflect on why it took this long for us to get that change. And, at E4D, we do a lot of public facing research as well on, people's perceptions of science and research as a structure. And so we have to ask ourselves, have we successfully portrayed the value of science and research to the public properly? Science that is federally funded essentially becomes the public good. And we have to be able to have our value proposition portrayed a little bit better. We are accountable to those dollars that we spend on research. And if we can't translate that into a perceived value to not only policymakers, but also to the public, then we're doing ourselves somewhat a disservice. And especially when we are looking at a potential election in the next year or two, I think it's really important for us to figure out ways that we can make science and research an election issue. We've been reflecting today on the fact that this is a huge investment for research, but ultimately, this was not one of the main buzz things that came out of the budget media cycles. We saw, a great piece in Nature. We saw a few op-eds, but this was not mainstream media, despite it being a huge win for our sector. So we have to ask ourselves, why is that? And how can we make the public care about this a little bit more? We're at a time right now where there is declining trust in institutions broadly across most democracies in the world, but scientists and science have maintained a very high level of credibility and trust. So how can we use this to leverage that and how can we mobilize this a little bit more? And so I'll leave that and hope to discuss some of these going forward.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Sarah. And Kate, please.
Thank you, Peter and Miradad and the CSPC team for pulling today together. And just before I get going here, my congratulations, Sarah, on your leadership and everything you achieved this year. it's a major win, and it's going to have a long-lasting impact for a lot of people. So well done. As noted, I'm Kate Murray. I'm the president and CEO of Canada's Stem Cell Network, and SCN's a national not-for-profit. We are focused on 3 key objectives: funding stem cell regenerative medicine from bench to bedside to marketplace, training the next generation of talent who will be our science and innovation leaders of tomorrow, and catalyzing the outputs of research for social, health, and economic benefits. So the work done by SCN is mission-driven, and it is a public good, just like those of my colleagues on this panel today. And as such, we've benefited from the support and trust of the federal government for many years. In fact, thanks to Strategic Science Fund programming, we will continue to deliver on our vision and our mandate through to the end of the decade. We've been asked today to consider what the budget means for not-for-profits. During our prep session, I think we all agreed there really was, as John alluded, no direct line between the budget and not-for-profits. However, there are some important messages, takeaways, even possibly a call to action for us. As we know, this budget was trying to do several things, much of it responsive. It had to respond to urgent political demands like housing and affordability. It had to respond to geopolitical demands, defense and security. And it had to respond to shortfalls from previous budgets, aka science and innovation. And its drafters were seeking, obviously, to address these demands under significant fiscal constraints. In addition, the budget is also a political document, and it was designed to meet a separate set of objectives that I won't get into this afternoon, but if you buy me an ice cream, I'll tell you about them. But what stood out to me, and was noted by Dave and Omar earlier today, was the budget's efforts to address growth and productivity. And from that perspective, I was really happy to see that science and innovation was included within the budget, along with the long overdue support for the next generation of talent. For many, many years, I've heard comments about science being just a suck on federal and provincial coffers. There's never enough money, I hear. The ivory tower doesn't produce outputs. They never come fast enough, and they're not big enough. We're tired of it. So to see support for research in a growth-themed budget was really exciting, because it suggests that that view and that narrative is changing. And I just really hope it's for good. But perhaps there's also an indirect message that not-for-profits can take away from the budget, that we are viewed and seen as part of Canada's productivity plan. It's not just about what industry and private investors and governments can offer. As not-for-profits, we're all contributing through developing talent, supporting technological advancements, driving policy, and de-risking innovations. One of the greatest differentiators between not-for-profits and the private sector is the freedom we have to take risk. We're not measured based on exits or IPOs. The lens from which SCN, the Stem Cell Network, evaluates where it will place its funding is not driven by the potential of shareholder returns. Rather, it's based on the rigor of the science and the talent base. And as such, we're de-risking and filling an important gap. Let me just give you an example. It was 2018 when an early career researcher, a pediatrician named Max Paganelli, and his researcher partner and wife, Claudia Raggi, submitted a funding application to the Stem Cell Network to address acute liver failure, which very often leads to sudden death. He wanted to develop his technology for an encapsulated liver tissue that would provide those suffering with acute liver failure from having to undergo an invasive transplant. It would give the liver the ability to keep functioning. And this way, those individuals would also avoid a lifetime of immunosuppressing drugs. That idea, it was novel, it was risky, but SCN decided to take a risk as the science was strong and had the potential to save thousands of lives every year. That initial research funding we provided was $100,000. Not a ton of money, but it paid off, and it led to future investments by us and others. To date, the Stem Cell Network has invested nearly $1 million in that technology. Without the support, this fundamental support at the start, Max and Claudia would never have been able to spin out their company, MorphoCell. MorphoCell now employs over a dozen people, high quality jobs, and they've recently announced $40 million US in an investment for their ReLiver technology. That's what not-for-profits can do, because we can take risks that others can't. To me, this exemplifies the value proposition that not-for-profits have. We build, we catalyze, we grow Canada's economic prosperity, its health, and its well-being. And I hope the government sees that unique value too, and continues to provide the foundational supports, the policies, and the regulations that we all need to drive our country forward. So I think I'll stop there and allow for some good conversation.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Kate. So a reminder to everyone to please drop any of your questions in the Q&A. I will start us off with a discussion piece. I wrote down a couple of good questions here, and you'll see the demographic poll popping up as well for the session. So I'm not sure who wants to take this, but we've talked about a lot of the positives coming out of the budget, a lot of the really strong initiatives coming forward. But do you see any major concerns that we should be looking at? Anything that's lacking in the budget? Anything that's missing and that we should really be thinking about in the next several years as concerning pieces going forward?
I'll pick up on that. I think, we've already talked about and heard a lot today about the governance changes that have been proposed. And one of the things that was talked about was the development of a national science and innovation strategy to be led by the Advisory Council on Science and Innovation. That's great. And I think what's going to be really important is ensuring that the not-for-profit sector, they're not just randomly consulted or considered, but they're clearly integrated within that strategy and are there at the table. So that's going to take all of us making sure that that happens and that we're there. I also, there was something there that Sarah's comments sparked for me. And, she was asking, why was this not a bigger story in the public media? It's as if the science piece went under the radar. And yeah, I think that there's a concern here. It's a message for us as not-for-profits that we need to be individually, collectively working on how we engage and the public and how we gain their support and find public champions. We need an informed electorate. If we don't, it'll be to our detriment. A prospering democracy means that we need citizens who are going to voice their support for entities like ours, and they do that by taking it to the ballot box based on what political parties put in their policy documents. So we need those policy documents to talk about the important role that science-based research organizations offer, and that we are there for the betterment of our country. So I think that's the call to action, is we need to ensure that our friends and our neighbors, even the Starbucks barista understands the value of what we bring to Canada. And so that they're there championing us, and they're asking, what about science? What about the not-for-profits? So we got to tell our stories loud and clear.
Great. John, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just want to basically echo what Kate has just said with a slightly different spin on it. We saw, and you know, echo the thanks to Sarah and her colleagues. We saw the effectiveness of students advocating in this budget. I think it's very clear that it was very focused. It was very, that did make the media. I mean, it was in all the major newspapers, the students marching and, you know, how they were getting paid less than minimum wage in spite of being top students with scholarships, etc. And so great. I think it's very important, though, that we don't sort of declare victory and say, hey, we're done now. Because Sarah's right. You know, it didn't make the front page of any major newspapers, all this generosity towards research and the implications of that. Artificial intelligence sort of made a brief, but that's the ChatGPT effect. I mean, everybody knows what artificial intelligence is or thinks they do now. So I think that it's really critical. It's one thing for researchers, you know, we saw students advocating for themselves because they're poverty stricken. Well, that was effective. They can't do that now, at least actually many of them can, most of them can. They're still poverty stricken, but you know, it looks like, oh, that's a problem solved, check the box. The lesson that we, MyTax, would give is what happened year before last, when it looked like, you know, we were going to get inadequate funding in Ontario to support, because we rely on provincial funding as well as federal funding. And, you know, the folks at the Ontario University said, well, is there anything we can do to help? To which my answer was, don't say anything, because the government doesn't necessarily care what universities think. We got very long custom letters from about 24 of our industry clients, you know, 3-page letters detailing why they thought that MyTax was doing a great job for them. That was effective. So I think the message for all of us, and it applies certainly to us in the not-for-profit world, is don't ask for yourself, get others to ask for you. The students were effective because they had a real case to be made. But the danger, and Chad Gaffield referred to this in his commentary in the academic session, for university researchers to say, you know, we need more money. Again, we get back to, I think, what Michelin was saying. Well, they always need more money. We need others to speak on our behalf. And I think that's the big challenge. And look, let's face it, there's an election coming up. If the polls are accurate, there's going to be a change in government. We need to look to the future, and we need to really, really get others and the public to understand what is the benefit of this investment. Let's stop talking about inputs and start talking about outputs. What's the impact? What are people getting for all these billions of dollars that have been pumped into things like artificial intelligence? And I think that's the new challenge. So I think we can pat ourselves on the back, and especially pat the students on the back. We were successful in this budget, or they were successful in this budget. Now the hard work really begins to really, because remember, a lot of this is back, except for the student fellowships, the granting council increases are back end loaded. And so we have to convince either the current government or the incoming different government, if there is one, that these are good investments. These are smart investments for the benefit of Canadians, not for the benefit of researchers or even of students, but the benefit of Canadians. And I think the talent story is one aspect, but I think just the story about the impact on healthcare, the impact on society, the 10 challenges that David Waters outlined, what are we doing to address those challenges? How are we helping sustainability and everything else? So I think that's what we have to not get complacent that, oh boy, great, we got billions of dollars. Our job is done. It's not done.
Excellent. Micheline or Sarah, would you like to jump in?
I think that was so well said. I might just leave it there.
I just wanted to echo the importance of students and innovation and studies and research as well. Even for us as a not-for-profit, we do some and we rely on it. And we try to take that knowledge into the hands of the people who need it. However, that knowledge needs to be also of quality, convincing to drive that innovation. For us, it's not necessarily economic innovation per se, but when we speak of sustainability, we speak of very many different aspects. Like I mentioned at the beginning, we try to advance the 17 SDGs, and they talk about very many different aspects. Some of them can be economic, and some of them are human related, or like the well-being of humans related. So we believe that giving money to research and to students could also help advance the SDGs as well on the long run, indirectly, perhaps.
Great. So I'll take one from the chat and I'll kind of extend it a little bit. Has there been a commitment from the government to index the new values of graduate scholarships on inflation going forward? And if not, how can we ensure that that's a priority going forward so we don't also see 20 years without an indexing?
I can start on this one probably. So the one good thing that we did see in the budget was a continued almost 200 million past the 5-year investment for the graduate student and scholarships and fellowships. So we saw the immediate investment that would increase the value and the number of awards. But we did see 200 million that will be recurring post those 5 years. So, it's not necessarily linking it to inflation, but it is allowing for some sort of sustainability in that program to grow, or you at least match up with inflation. Tying it directly to inflation is difficult. This was a core value that Sephora Science was advocating for, and I had advocated for. It's difficult in practice. You look at years like we've just had where, the inflation is higher and it imposes too much risk in the process. So I think we're more likely to see some of this more sustained funding type allocations. It does kind of open the door to say, in 5 years, we should reflect and have some sort of system in place. And that was, a secondary option that we had talked about with the Standing Committee on Science and Research was, if we're not going to index it, we should have some sort of structure so that in 5 years' time, we reflect back and say, is this matching what is internationally competitive? Is this matching what Canada needs? So having some sort of check mechanism there. And I think this is why, there's a need for groups like Sephora Science to exist in a more permanent kind of, or some sort of aspect so that they can host to that accountability side. Maybe I'll see what others have to say about it.
If anyone else would like to jump in. John?
Yeah, just very quickly. I mean, governments in general, and Sarah said it, it's too risky to promise inflationary increases because that makes budgets pretty hard to predict. So I think I think that, again, getting back to what I said, the job is not over. We can't wait 20 years to increase these again. And, we're hopefully in a low inflationary environment. So it's an issue that we can postpone for a few years. But I think, constant pressure. And again, hopefully the advisory committee will address that. I think the bigger challenge is the many students who don't have fellowships, and that's been brought up by Sarah and others, making sure that they get decent pay in a grant funding environment that's improving, but still insufficient to really provide the support the students need.
I just wanted to add, Peter, one of the examples that we used for this argument was Australia, because they currently index their graduate student scholarships regularly. The big difference between their system and ours is that in Australia, and I mean, someone correct me if I'm wrong on this, but when you apply for a graduate student fellowship, you are only able to be funded directly through the federal government. You don't get additional support through your supervisors. And so they're able to centralize it in a way that allows it to be indexed, and like the structure is just totally different to the way that we do it here. I think the fear is that, index the scholarships, fellowships, but not the research grants. And then you just perpetually get this kind of growing scholarship and nothing that would ever match it. And so that creates some inequity. But in their case, they're able to centralize that funding from one source and provide the indexing that way.
Great. On the international lens, I'll jump to a different question, which is with many of your nonprofits being federal and with international counterparts around the world, how does the current budget position Canada on the international stage with regards to your different areas?
Well, I can tell you from my space, there used to be many years ago a number of networks similar to ours around the world. For different reasons, mostly financial, they mostly don't exist anymore, which is really unfortunate. And so that puts Canada in a unique position, puts us ahead because we've got this very strong pan-Canadian network of multidisciplinary experts who are collaborating and working in the regenerative medicine space and driving it forward. And we also get to wave the flag as stem cells were proven by James Till and Ernst McCullough in the 60s to Canadians. And so this, I think Canada stands in a very strong space in the stem cell regenerative medicine spot globally. Additionally, I'd note that the government has continued to be a strong proponent and supporter of this space. Since I've come into the network, there's been 20 million plus that they've invested into the organization. That's really fueled the area. And we're seeing that in the outputs that are coming. The demand for clinical trials activity, the number of spinouts that are happening, the new emerging ECRs, the early career researchers who are starting to drive towards our space. So I think it's a really strong space, and it speaks to what that government support's done. It's really fueled momentum for us, which is terrific. And we're seeing that in outputs like, the morphocell example I gave at the top, or through clinical trials that are saving the lives of infants, or supporting people with giving them leading edge therapies for things like type 1 diabetes and multiple sclerosis. So Canada's a top driver there, and but we couldn't do it without the government with us.
Anyone else want to jump in? John?
Yeah, I think there wasn't much specific in this budget for international collaboration, but of course, Canada's recently joined Horizon Europe. I think that's a big step forward. And it's been, I think Canadian researchers have been waiting for that for a long time. An advantage, just spinning off what Kate just said, an advantage that we have as not-for-profits is, in a sense, increased flexibility, partly because we get funding from many different sources and we have collaborations and can seek funding for collaborations. So, 15% of my tax activity is international networks. And that's actually supported by the federal government, but also, we can engage directly with international partners. So I'm seeing a lot of international activity going on. It's a little bit getting back to what David Waters said about the, whatever it was, 170 different organizations supporting innovation and research. It's a bit of a complex landscape. So it would be nice to have some coordination, one door for Canada kind of thing. That may be addressed by the Science Innovation Advisory Council when it gets created.
Great. Sarah?
Yeah, all I want to add is this budget enough for us to see a vision for what this will be in 5, 10, 20 years from now? I think that is where we have to set ourselves if we're talking about international kind of comparisons and competition. This budget was enough to maybe level the playing field. The scholarships and fellowships are now still below the US, still below Europe, but they're at least in the range of what we wanted. Total funding we saw in Dave Waters is, still that gap is growing. So, there's a sense of like this lack of vision a little bit that scares me a little bit. I think this was like this is a good first step. And I think this is maybe what a lot of us have been getting at is this was a good first step, but there's still a lot of work to do. And we obviously have a lot of value proposition to continue to prove to government and the public. But, even just the brain drain idea is where I kind of think about the international kind of landscape is, is it enough for a brain gain? I don't know if I'm sold on that. I think it's enough to maybe stop a small percentage of people of leaving. I'll plug that my team at the Auto Science Policy Network did some really great surveying on brain drain, and they were showing that graduate students were leaving due to financial reasons. They were going for jobs, they were going for higher salaries, and they were staying in Canada for family, for mental health reasons, for healthcare. And I think that right there shows you like brain drain and international mobilization is a personal decision. If we don't incentivize, researchers to stay, PhD grads to stay, businesses to come in and stay in Canada, then we're not fixing the problem from a vision standpoint. We're just kind of leveling it out.
Micheline, anything you'd like to add?
Thank you, Peter. I'm still going to take it from the lens of sustainability and the work we do. As I mentioned, this budget has a lot of mention of decarbonization, green transition, green economy, etc. And for us, that's a good sign going to the right direction. How it ties up to international work. We are an international network, but we are, as I say, we are interdependent on each other for work, but independent in our finances. Basically, Future Earth Montreal, Canada is independent from Future Earth Paris, for instance. However, the mention that I was very happy to see as well that Canada will be part of Horizon at this point, because we have tried to work with European colleagues on collaborative projects in research, and somehow they would get their funding from Horizon, but we were not eligible, and now we could. Or our collaborators in universities could, and for us that is also a good news. I'll stop there. Thank you, Peter.
Great, thanks. Seeing one in the chat as well of how important was the establishment of the SRSR committee to your work? Is there any sense that changes in government structure and what's counted is what counts plays a role?
I can kick us off if we want. The Standing Committee for Science and Research played a big role for us to be able to tell who our champions were. I think it was clear to us from the beginning, who was proposing these different types of projects, and the graduate student scholarships and fellowships was a dedicated project that happened a year ago. So, we were able to kind of see in that who our champions were. There was another study the year before that, almost a year exactly ago before that, on top talent and retaining top talent in Canada. So, those themes were resonant there. And I think the production of their reports was a great synthesis on the environment and the players and who was advocating for things like that at the time. I have to flag that the Standing Committee did also write a personalized letter to the Minister of Finance, trying to advocate for the funding as well, so the scholarships and fellowships and the grant piece. So it's hard to tell exactly how impactful it was in its entirety, but it gave a really good platform for people to meet. And truthfully, I have to say that I met the co-founders of the Support of Science campaign through my own witness testimony to the Standing Committee. I would not have known if there was another person out there who was also saying what I was saying. And we both spoke on that committee a few years ago and then connected afterwards, and we're saying, our witness testimonies were basically the same. Let's go and figure something out. And that was how Support of Science was mobilized from the student perspective. So yeah, I'll maybe leave it there.
I think when we talk about or think about advocacy, you have to use all of the tools, and the parliamentary committees are one tool, and each one of the parliamentarians are also important because they can serve as champions. So building those relationships so that they understand where you're coming from is vitally important. And then being able to collectively share your message in that forum is important. It's not just important for what they hear, but it's also important for how you drive the energy of your community, to report back to them and to share with them. We were there on Parliament Hill. We were talking to parliamentarians, to those who are engaged. And now we need you to reinforce that and to go that step further. So I think you also need to think about how you also leverage those meetings and those opportunities with your community to excite them and to encourage more advocacy.
Yeah, I'll weigh in a little bit. One never knows what the winning argument is when budgets get created and governments make policy decisions. I think the standing committee was a contributor. I think more important is there was a unity in the message that was being transmitted by the research community. I mean, I appeared in front of the standing committee. I remember getting these goofy headphones that I had to wear. They insisted I wear their headphones, even though I already had a pair of them. I've got 2 pairs at home. And I think the message, the talent message that everybody focused on and everybody knew they should focus on, that was effective. And so the standing committee was hearing something that, Bouchard was saying. I mean, there was a lot of input into this. And also it helped that this was sort of the Gen Z budget, the housing and students budget as well. So a lot of things came together. So standing committee was a contributor. They were a positive force. Whether they were key or not, I mean, I have no way of knowing. We all spoke to them, but whether they were listened to versus, I mean, it's very clear that the budget decisions are ultimately made in the Department of Finance. And Champagne he's a very energetic guy, very good communicator. But if the collective us, including him, can't convince Department of Finance, then it's not going to happen.
Micheline, anything to add?
No, thank you, Peter. Nothing, because neither myself nor my office has had any interaction with the committee, so I cannot really comment. I'm sorry.
Okay. Well, I think we're getting to just about time, so I wanted to take this opportunity to say thank you very much to all the panelists, to all of the audience members who have joined us throughout the day, and to please take a look at the chat line. There's a few things on behalf of the CSPC that's coming up, the deadline for the panel submission. There's a number of virtual sessions coming up and the CSPC newsletter, and you'll also see a feedback poll popping up on your screen as well. So thank you very much for your attendance. Thank you very much to our 4 panelists for your excellent insights for the nonprofit panel. Good things to look forward to, I hope, in the years to come. Lots of things to keep on our radar as well. But thank you very much for all your insights. It's very much appreciated. All right. With that, take care.
Peter.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks so much.